Annyeonghaseyo, colleagues. It is a great pleasure and privilege to be able to speak with you today. I remember with great affection the time I spent at the Korean National Open University a few years ago, and it's great to be back with you, even if it's only virtually. So, how do we support student success in online learning through data? Well, using student data for student success is all about a field now called learning analytics. The three stages of learning analytics are finding appropriate data, analyzing it, sometimes using statistical methods, sometimes visualizing it, and then applying the results to improve student success. Different kinds of data could be analyzed for different purposes. You could use data to increase student enrollment, to save money, or even to increase staff salaries, although I don't think that happens very often. Learning analytics is a very fast-growing field. I found more than 320 million hits on Google alone for learning analytics in higher education. Well, I can't cover 320 million hits in this presentation, so I want to focus on the three kinds of data that I think work best for supporting student success. These are student progress data, student personal data, and online course module data. Let me start with the first. Here's an example of student progress data in learning analytics. I've taken this from a UK Open University module. The data is displayed visually on what's called a student progress dashboard. This is a screenshot of a dashboard, and it's not particularly clear, so I've made up a clearer example. This dashboard is for a module that has 4 assignments. These are shown by circles in the second column for 3 students, A, B, and C. Green circles are completed and passed assignments. Red circles are completed but failed assignments, and open circles are uncompleted assignments. The assignment grade is shown in each circle. Based on the data analysis of previous results, you can see that the dashboard suggests that student A has failed 2 assignments, that's column 2, and has a very high risk, therefore, of not submitting the last assignment, column 3. So student A is very likely to fail the whole module, column 7. Student C has passed 3 assignments, but with very low grades, so also has a high risk of not submitting their last assignment. So student C is at risk of failing overall. Student B, however, has passed all 3 assignments so far and is very likely to submit the 4th assignment and pass the whole module. Clearly, the dashboard is telling us that we should intervene in some way with students A and C. But who intervenes and when? Well, there are several choices for who intervenes. It could be a real person, such as a tutor, and that intervention might well be effective. But if you have very large numbers of students, hundreds of students, that's going to need a lot of real people and will be extremely expensive as a result. Could the intervention be an automatic mail message? Well, that will be very inexpensive, but we don't know how effective it might be. How would you feel if you were a student just getting automatic emails? Maybe one day we'll be able to combine our interventions using artificial intelligence systems. Maybe that will be both effective and inexpensive. But I'm not aware of any such system that's available yet. As important as who does the intervention is when does the intervention happen? Here are the stages in one example. The student writes the assignment, the tutor marks the assignment, uploads the result to the database when it appears on the dashboard for action. The problem here is out-of-date data, the delays in the system. My experience is that students can make a dropout decision very quickly. But you have to wait for the assignment due date, and then the tutor has to mark the assignment immediately, which doesn't always happen. Then by the time the dashboard indicates a need for intervention, the student may already have dropped out, and retrieving them then is probably unlikely. To help overcome this problem, you could try frequent, short, formative quizzes that don't count for assessment, but students may tend to skip them. You could put in summative computer-marked assignments, which do count for assessment. That's better, but you still have the problem of waiting for the due date. A student might look at the assignment, think it's too difficult, decide not to carry on, but by the time you find out, he's already gone. So might it be possible to get data in real time? Well, it's not too difficult to set up a system that, for example, collects data such as the number of clicks per day that a student is making in the virtual learning environment, such as Moodle. I've made up a fictional example for 3 students over 8 days of clicking on the web page. You can see that if you have many students, the problem here might be having too much data. And as the English saying goes, not being able to see the wood for the trees. Much more sophisticated examples might be possible. You may well have come across this Microsoft productivity score in Microsoft Teams. It's designed to allow employers to remotely monitor their employers' communications, collaborations, meetings, phone calls, emails, and so on. There are about 70 metrics. Such a system could be adapted to watch for students and catch those who have stopped actively working on the university's VLE or communicating with other students. Interestingly, only very recently, Microsoft have dropped the ability to identify the work of individuals for privacy reasons. And I don't know of a working system that gathers that amount and kind of detail for students yet. But even if such a system existed, there is still the problem of who intervenes and when. There are other ways of getting real-time data. There are emotional detection systems, which claim to be able to detect a student's emotional state. For example, mo2it.com offers software that can use a student's webcam to monitor their facial expression. If the software picks up a puzzled, bored, or worried look, it can generate an immediate alert. But like the other previous student progress monitoring data, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that such data has yet been used to enhance student success. And there are very important ethical and privacy issues. Let me tell you a story about that. A few years ago, an American college issued all its students with free laptops. Well, that was a great news. But it neglected to tell the students that the college could switch on the webcam privately without telling the students or their families. You can imagine the storm of anger that occurred when this was discovered. Privacy is becoming a much more important issue these days. Well, is there good evidence that using learning analytics in student progress monitoring data actually enhances student success? Well, I've not seen good evidence yet. And what I mean by good evidence are random controlled trials that compare groups of students. But to be fair, there is huge international activity in learning analytics, so there may be good evidence coming. Perhaps learning analytics combined with artificial intelligence may be helpful in promoting student success. But you have to always beware in these situations, colleagues, of the hype. There are many private consultancies out there very keen to sell their student monitoring data software, and you need to look very carefully for the evidence that it really works. And you also need to be extremely careful about privacy and ethical issues. So my message, I think, colleagues, is you must monitor the internet for developments. You must do your research on what might actually help at your university to effectively monitor your students' progress. My second topic is using learner analytics to study students' personal data and make predictive modules. This is a project that I ran a few years ago in the UK OU. It was a binary logistic statistical analysis based on the data of previous students, which could attach a predicted probability of success to new students. This was the percentage chance of them succeeding on their module. This graph shows the variation in predictions of success for the approximately 30,000 new students who were entering the UK OU in 2004. The predicted probability of success varies from about 9% chance of success for a very few students, up to an 83% chance of success for a slightly larger number of students. But most students are somewhere in the middle. So, for example, the dotted black lines here show that about 6,500 students had a predicted probability of success of between 40 and 50%. What does this actually mean? Well, it means that that particular group of students shared characteristics which suggested that around 40 to 50% of them would succeed on the module. The most important predictors, in order of importance, were the student's module level. Students entering the year one of a module were more successful than students entering a year two module. Secondly was the credit rating of a module. Students on 15 credit modules, that's roughly 1/8 of full-time study, were more successful than students on 30 or 60 credits. Thirdly was the student's previous education qualifications. The higher those qualifications, the more successful the student was likely to be. Fourthly was the student's module choice. Arts and social science students were more successful than maths or science students. Fifthly, their socio-economic status. The higher their status, the more likely they were to be successful. Sixthly was their sex. Women were in general more likely to be successful than men. And finally, their age. The older the student, the more likely they were to succeed. These particular predictors are specific to the UK Open University, which has no entry qualifications. Other universities, of course, will have different predictors. The predictions are surprisingly accurate in average terms, of course. However, they are not as accurate at low levels as we were hoping, and we find that quite hard to understand. Well, how could we use this data? There seem to me to be three ways of using this probability of success data. We could use it for research. We could focus support on the most vulnerable students, or we could select the students we thought were most likely to succeed. Because I was working for an open university where access was particularly important, I chose 1 and 2, research and focusing support. So I took a group of around 5,000 students in my local region, and I arranged the data in order of the lowest prediction to the highest. I can't show you the whole 5,000 predictions, of course, but here are the lowest and the highest few. You can see one thing straight away. Women are more highly represented in the highest predictions than men. That's only partly because they're more likely to be taking arts courses. Here are the bottom few on the list. You can see that it's all men who are taking maths, science, and technology modules. And the lowest prediction of success probability is only 9.4%. Well, how to use this data? What we did was we divided the students up alternately into two groups. So that we had two groups of students with similar predicted probability success, the green group and the blank group. And what we did was we treated the green group as our experimental group, and the blank group we left as our control group. We then phoned up the students in the green group. The phone calls were quite short, 5 to 10 minutes. They were designed to be encouraging and particularly motivational. We then, at the end of the year, compared the success rates in the two groups. We repeated the experiment over 4 years with a large number of students, and we found that there was a steady increase in success of an average of about 5% in the experimental group. 5% doesn't sound like a big increase in success, but it was the result of apparently just one phone call. It was also very cost effective. The income increase we got from the higher success rate was greater than the cost of the phone calls, and more phone calls might have had a larger effect. And because we had used groups with equal average predictions, the results were very statistically reliable. But there were two ethical issues that worried me. The first one was, were we targeting support and introducing a bias? We were using our limited resources in focusing the support on the students with the lowest prediction. But was that targeting ethical? Did it introduce an unexpected bias? In this example, for instance, we were targeting more men than women for the extra support. My second example is about disclosure. Say you have a student who has a very low prediction, say a predicted 10% probability of passing their module. Do you tell them? There are two ethical questions. The issue of justice is quite clear. A student should be entitled to know to avoid the possibility of wasting their time and money. And also the EU data protection law says that they should be told. But as well as justice, I owe the student a duty of care. What is the effect of being told your prediction? If I said to the student, the data suggests you only have a 10% chance of passing this module, would that demotivate the student completely so that they immediately dropped out? So there are two ethical issues here. Are you happy to target support on vulnerable students, even if this introduces some other kind of bias? Yes or no? And secondly, disclosure. Are you happy to tell a student their predicted chance of success, even if it's very low? I'd be very interested to hear in the discussion what your feelings are on that. I do have one kind of answer to that second dilemma. When thinking about the disclosure problem, there may be a way of getting around it by allowing students to assess their predicted probability of success privately on their own by a self-assessed questionnaire. And as a result, importantly, give them the opportunity to change their probability. The idea was to ask fairly simple questions of the students, such as, are you male or female? How old are you? And get the student to calculate a score based on his or her answers. For example, our questionnaire said, if you're male, subtract 5 points from the initial score. If you're female, don't change it. This is part of an example of such a questionnaire, and there were 8 questions in all. Here's the second part of the questionnaire, which allows students to calculate their final score. I won't go through it in detail because the questions are quite specific to the Open University, but they cover the student's module choice, their previous education, occupation, and so on. And at the end of the questionnaire, the student can calculate their final score. The scoring was based on the predictive module. The idea was that students who got a low score, let's say 50% or lower chance of success, could be encouraged to think about ways in which they could increase their score. For instance, they could register for fewer modules or start at a lower level or improve their previous qualifications and so on. The difficulty was finding a phrasing that would convince the student that they were on too high a level or had enrolled for too many modules without deterring them completely. I was never convinced that I'd found the right phrases to use, so I never had the courage to pilot the questionnaire. So I'll never know whether it would have worked or not. But I have a colleague in the University of South Africa who's rather more courageous than me, and he used such a test with his students. He found that students who were given feedback about their chances of success actually did rather better than expected. What would you think would happen with your students in a similar setup? My third set of examples of the use of data doesn't apply to students directly. It applies to course modules. This is an example of something called the Z-score. If we knew the predicted probability of success of students on a particular module, it is possible to apply a statistical analysis to predict what the overall module success rate should be. It looks something like this. For each of the UK Open University course modules, the system can calculate what its pass rate should be from its student population and compare it with the actual pass rate. The system then calculates a Z-score, which measures the difference. A Z-score of more than -3 means that the course is not doing as well as it should and needs some attention. I've taken 4 of the 250 modules at the UKOU with their actual student pass rates and their calculated pass rates together with their Z-scores. So for examples, in green, the Introducing Religions and Exploring Philosophy modules are doing better than expected with z-scores greater than +3. These are the modules in green. But the module inside music is doing much worse than expected, with a z-score of -6.34. So this is the one in red. So in this case, the module authors will be asked to investigate why their success rate is so low. This may increase student success as a result. So far my examples have been about analyzing data statistically. But presenting data visually can also help. Here are 3 examples of the visual presentation of data. My first example is of a scattergram. This shows exam pass rates on the vertical axis versus getting to the exam rates on the horizontal axis. The dotted lines are the average get and pass rates, and each point represents one of about 150 modules in the UK OU. So for instance, the module with the red arrow is a course called Introduction to Law. You'll see it's what is called an outlier. It's a long way from the other points on the scattergram. It has a high getting to the exam rate. Nearly 90% of the students actually sit the exam, but a very low pass rate. Only about 60% actually pass the module. So a lot of students get as far as the exam, but then fail it. This might suggest that compared with other modules, it doesn't prepare students for the exam as well as it should. Or perhaps the exam is not a fair assessment of what the students have been taught. The module with the green arrow is a math course. Not many students get as far as the exam, only about 55%, but then most pass it, around 98%. That may seem a lot fairer. The course is sifting students out, but if they get to the exam, they have a very good chance of passing it. Another way of looking at a module is to look how students drop out when they're studying it. So this example is what I call a rivergram. It shows how Open University students dropped out during a particular module. The width of the river is proportional to the number of students who are active at any point in the module. So 100 students start at the beginning of the course on the left, and at each assignment, some students continue on in the progress channel, but some drop out down the exit channel. Most drop out at the first assignment. A few skip that assignment, apparently about 2, and come back to the second assignment, but only very few. So you can see how critical that first assignment is. There is more dropout at each successive assignment because overall dropout on this module is nearly 50%. So if you know the critical points at which students drop out of a module, you can begin to try to understand why. My final example is a very simple one. It's a dropout versus time graph. It shows the total withdrawals week by week from when the students initially register, back in March in this case, every week until the end of year exam in October the following year. You can see that there are steady withdrawals even before the course actually starts, and that the withdrawals peak, first of all, when the module materials first arrive, and then there is another peak when the final fees are due. I won't go into the data in more detail because it's quite specific to the Open University, but you can see that it might be possible to get some idea of the critical intervention points by using such a graph. Well, so finally, to summarize, how might student data be used in learning analytics to increase student success? Of the three ways I've used as examples, we can say in student progress data, there are many possibilities for increasing success, but we don't have a lot of evidence yet. Student personal data, there is evidence for some increase in success, but you have to be careful about privacy and ethical concerns. And with online course module data, well, we only have indirect evidence, but there is great potential here, I think, for modifying modules to increase student success. So my summary of my summary is that there are great possibilities here, but there's a lot more work needed to understand the potentials and a great deal more evidence to be found. Each university will have to find the data that works best for them. And again, beware the hype from companies that want you to buy their expensive software. Finally, let me tell you a story that illustrates the danger of relying on data without being very careful. In the summer of 2020, 17-year-old students in the UK could not sit their final exams because of the pandemic. So how to give them grades that they could use for university entrance? Well, this was the job of a government body called Ofqual, the UK Office of Qualifications and Examinations Regulation. Since there were no exams, Ofqual decided to use a predictive model based on previous year's data to allocate grades to students. One of the predictive data they used was the grading of the student's school. In the UK, schools are graded 1 to 4, where 1 is excellent and 4 is poor, the lowest grade for a badly performing school. What happened was that bright students from poor schools, therefore, were given poor grades. This caused an outrage when it was discovered because such students were being badly penalized for something that wasn't at all their fault, and the model had to be withdrawn. So there's a moral here. When you're using predictive outcomes, be very careful to choose your data properly and watch out for unwanted outcomes. So thank you very much, colleagues. I hope you found this interesting and helpful. and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments in the discussion later. You'll find more on this project in my book, Supporting Students for Success in Online and Distance Education. You may also find some useful articles, presentations, and book chapters on my website, www.ormondsimpson.com. All of those are completely free to use. Thank you again, colleagues.